Did you know that Connecticut has the highest per capita income of any state in the entire United States? Or that it is home to some of the wealthiest zip codes in the country, neighborhoods where the median household income is so far above the national average that it barely registers on the same scale? How about the fact that Connecticut has produced more insurance industry wealth than almost any other state, earning Hartford the nickname the insurance capital of the world, a title it held for over a century? Or that Yale University, one of the most elite and well-endowed institutions of higher education on the planet, sits right in the middle of a Connecticut city with some of the highest poverty rates in the country. Connecticut is a small state, the third smallest in the Union by area, but it contains contradictions that are large enough to be genuinely hard to process. It is simultaneously one of the richest places in America and home to some of the most distressed urban communities in the Northeast. It has extraordinary wealth concentrated in certain corners and extraordinary poverty concentrated in others. And the gap between those two realities is not narrowing. It is growing. And almost nobody outside of Connecticut talks about it. Today we are. Let us start with the wealth, because you have to understand how real and how deep it is before the contrast can land properly. Fairfield County, which sits in the southwestern corner of Connecticut along the Long Island Sound, is one of the wealthiest counties in the United States by almost any measure you want to apply. Greenwich, the county's most famous municipality, has been a byword for American wealth for generations. It is where hedge fund managers live. It is where corporate executives commute from to Manhattan, a train ride away. It is where old money and new money coexist on properties that feature acreage, guest houses, and water views that belong in a different mental category than what most Americans mean when they say the word neighborhood. Greenwich is not an outlier within Fairfield County. Westport, Darien, New Canaan, Wilton, Ridgefield. These communities represent a concentration of wealth that is unusual even by the standards of the American Northeast. The median home prices in these towns have been among the highest in the country for decades. The school systems, funded substantially by local property taxes, are lavishly resourced. The infrastructure is excellent. The quality of daily life for residents who can afford to participate in it is genuinely exceptional. Moving slightly inland and north, Litchfield County offers a different flavor of Connecticut wealth. Rolling hills, horse farms, beautifully preserved New England village centers, antique shops, excellent restaurants, and the kind of quiet, tasteful prosperity that does not announce itself the way Fairfield County wealth does. This is the Connecticut of weekend escapes for New Yorkers, of historic inns and covered bridges and fall foliage on country roads. Hartford County has its own pockets of significant wealth. The suburban towns surrounding Hartford, Avon, Simsbury, Glastonbury, South Windsor, are prosperous, well-maintained communities with strong school systems and high quality of life. The insurance and financial services industries that made Hartford wealthy for over a century created a substantial professional class that settled in these communities and built a comfortable, stable suburban life that persists even as the city at its center has faced severe difficulties. Connecticut's wealth is real, documented, and concentrated. It is not a myth or an exaggeration. By the numbers, this is one of the most economically successful places in the country. Now let us talk about what sits right alongside all of that wealth, because the juxtaposition is stark enough to be genuinely disorienting once you start looking at it directly. Hartford, the state capital, consistently ranks among the poorest cities in the United States. Not the poorest cities in Connecticut, the poorest cities in the entire country. The child poverty rate in Hartford has, at various points, exceeded 40%. The school system struggles with underfunding relative to need, high rates of student homelessness and housing instability, and the accumulated challenges of educating a population facing profound economic stress. The The city's infrastructure shows the effects of decades of disinvestment. The contrast between Hartford's gleaming insurance company headquarters and the neighborhoods that surround them is jarring in a way that is difficult to describe adequately without seeing it. Bridgeport, Connecticut's largest city by population, sits in Fairfield County, the same county as Greenwich. It is, depending on the year and the metric, among the poorest cities in the Northeast. Its median household income is a fraction of what it is in the wealthy suburbs that surround it. Its unemployment rate is significantly higher. Its school system faces challenges that are almost incomprehensible given the proximity to extraordinary wealth. Bridgeport and Greenwich are separated by roughly 20 miles of highway. They might as well be in different countries by the metrics that matter most to the daily lives of their residents. New Haven, home to Yale University, presents perhaps the most visible version of this contradiction. Yale is one of the wealthiest universities in the world. Its endowment is measured in the tens of billions of dollars. Its campus is architecturally magnificent. Its faculty are among the most credentialed and accomplished in their fields, and its graduates go on to positions of power and influence in virtually every sector of American life. And it sits in a city where significant portions of the residential neighborhoods are marked by poverty, vacancy, crime, and the slow deterioration that comes from decades of economic decline. Waterbury, once known as the Brass City for its industrial manufacturing heritage, has experienced one of the more dramatic urban declines in New England. The manufacturing jobs that built the city are gone. The population has declined substantially from its peak. The tax base has eroded. The city has cycled through fiscal crises, corruption scandals at the highest levels of government, and the social pathologies that tend to accompany concentrated poverty and institutional breakdown. How did this happen? How does the wealthiest state in America end up with some of the most distressed cities in the country? The answer involves history, economics, policy, and a set of structural choices whose consequences have compounded over generations. The industrial history of Connecticut's cities is where the story begins. Hartford, Bridgeport, New Haven, Waterbury, and other Connecticut cities were, through much of the 19th and 20th centuries, serious industrial powerhouses. Connecticut manufacturing produced firearms, hardware, clocks, brass goods, submarines, aircraft engines, and an enormous range of other products. The Colt Firearms Factory in Hartford was one of the most famous manufacturing facilities in American history. The Winchester rifle was made in New Haven. The manufacturing economy supported dense, working-class urban populations who built communities, institutions, churches, and a civic life that was genuine and durable. Then deindustrialization came. The process was slow and then fast, and it hit Connecticut's industrial cities with particular severity. Manufacturing jobs moved south to lower-wage states, then overseas to even lower-wage countries. The factories that had organized entire urban economies closed or drastically reduced their workforces. The tax revenue that had supported city services declined. The middle-class residents who could afford to leave did, following the jobs and the new suburban developments that were expanding across the state's countryside. What remained in the cities was an increasingly concentrated population of people with fewer options and fewer resources, served by city governments with declining revenues and increasing demands. The suburban flight that hit Connecticut's cities was accelerated by dynamics that were partly racial and deeply tied to federal housing policy in the post-war period. Mortgage lending policies, highway construction, and zoning laws combined to enable and encourage white middle-class families to leave cities for suburbs, while making it structurally difficult for Black and Latino families to follow. The result was urban communities that became progressively more racially and economically segregated from their surrounding suburbs, a pattern that locked in inequality and made it structurally very hard to address. The education funding system in Connecticut is both a cause and a consequence of this inequality. And it is one of the most argued about policy issues in a state that has been arguing about it for decades. Connecticut funds its public schools primarily through local property taxes. This is a system used by most states in the country, but its consequences are particularly stark in Connecticut because of the extreme gap in property values between wealthy suburbs and poor cities. Greenwich and Darien can fund their schools extraordinarily well because their property tax base is enormous. Hartford and Bridgeport have far less property wealth to tax, which means that even at higher tax rates, they generate far less revenue per student than their wealthy neighbors. The state does provide supplemental funding to lower wealth districts, and Connecticut has been the site of significant litigation over the adequacy of that funding. The Sheff versus O'Neill case, decided by the Connecticut Supreme Court in 1996, found that the segregation of Hartford's public schools was unconstitutional and led to the development of magnet school programs designed to promote integration between Hartford and its suburbs. These programs have had real effects and are genuinely among the more innovative school integration efforts in the country. But they have not solved the fundamental problem, which is that the schools serving the poorest students in Connecticut remain dramatically under-resourced relative to the schools serving the wealthiest. The consequences of this funding gap are not abstract. They show up in test scores, graduation rates, college attendance rates, and eventually in the economic trajectories of the children who go through these different systems. A child born in Hartford and a child born in Greenwich, 20 miles away, face dramatically different educational opportunities, and those differences compound over the course of a lifetime. The wealth of Connecticut as a state does not translate into equal opportunity for the children who live within its borders. The fiscal situation of Connecticut's cities is another dimension of this problem that gets less attention than it deserves. Several of Connecticut's cities have been in or near fiscal crisis at various points over the last few decades. Hartford came close to filing for bankruptcy in 2017 before the state stepped in with a significant bailout. Bridgeport actually filed for bankruptcy in the early 1990s, becoming one of the largest American cities to do so at that time. Waterbury has had its finances managed by a state oversight board following fiscal crises driven by mismanagement and declining revenues. The structural problem is that these cities are caught in a fiscal trap that is very difficult to escape. High concentrations of poverty mean high demand for city services, social services, public safety, healthcare infrastructure, housing assistance. But poverty also means a limited property tax base to fund those services. The state constitution limits what Connecticut cities can do to raise revenue in other ways. And the state's own fiscal situation, which has been challenging for years due to pension obligations and other structural costs, limits the amount of aid that can flow from the state to the cities that need it most. The pension crisis at the state level is its own chapter. Connecticut has some of the largest unfunded pension liabilities relative to its size of any state in the country. Decades of promises made to public sector workers, teachers, state employees, municipal workers, were not adequately funded as they were made, and the gap between what was promised and what was set aside has grown into an obligation that consumes an enormous share of state revenue. This constrains everything else the state can do, including the investments in cities and schools that might begin to address the inequality problem. There are people working on these problems, and there are reasons to believe that some things can change, even if the pace of change is frustratingly slow relative to the scale of the challenge. The magnet school programs that grew out of the Sheff litigation have genuinely helped some students access better educational opportunities than they would have had otherwise, and they represent a model of voluntary integration that has been studied by other states. The state has at various times committed to increased aid to its poorest school districts, though the implementation of these commitments has been inconsistent and contested. Some of Connecticut's struggling cities have seen genuine, if partial, revitalization in specific neighborhoods and sectors. New Haven's downtown has been significantly revitalized over the last 2 decades, with Yale playing an active role as an anchor institution that has invested in the surrounding community. Bridgeport has had periods of renewed development interest. Hartford has seen some investment in its downtown core. These are real developments, not invented optimism. Connecticut also has genuine assets that could, with the right investments and policies, anchor a broader revival. Its location between New York and Boston, two of the largest economic centers in the country, makes it inherently well-positioned for certain kinds of economic activity. Its research universities produce talent and intellectual capital. Its natural environment, the Long Island Sound coastline, the river valleys, the hills and forests of the interior, supports a quality of life that attracts people who have choices about where to live. But the honest conclusion of this story is that Connecticut has not solved its central contradiction. It remains a state where extraordinary wealth and profound poverty exist in close proximity, where a child's life chances are enormously determined by which side of that divide they are born on, and where the structural factors that produce that inequality have proven stubbornly resistant to the reform efforts that have been attempted. The wealthiest state in America should not have some of the poorest cities in America. That sentence should not be true. The fact that it is, and has been for decades, is not an accident or a mystery. It is the result of specific historical choices, specific policy structures, and specific failures of political will that have been allowed to persist while the wealth in the rest of the state has continued to accumulate. Connecticut is a place of genuine beauty, genuine history, and genuine achievement. It is also a place with a problem that its wealth makes harder to excuse and easier, in theory, to solve. Whether the will to solve it exists is the question that Connecticut has been failing to answer for a very long time. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for new videos every week. We cover geography, culture, and the real stories behind American places. If you are curious about the way wealth and poverty shape communities and what it means for the people who live inside those systems, this is the channel for you.